What if I told you that beneath every medieval castle stood not just stone, but the aching backs of men who never saw its banquet halls? That before the dawn broke through the misty fields, someone had already bled into the earth for your bread? This is not a tale of kings and queens, but of calluses and cracked hands, of prayers whispered into damp soil. This is the story of the medieval farmer. The cock did not crow. It rasped, broken and thin, as though it too resented the weight of another day. The farmer, whose name no chronicle had ever recorded, rose without a sound. His bones remembered the hour before his mind did, and his hands, stiff from yesterday's frost, fumbled for the coarse tunic by the fireless hearth. Outside, the village was still wrapped in a woolen shroud of fog, the kind that clung low and damp to the ankles. The fields, his fields, waited like a sleeping beast, hungry, never satisfied. No songs greeted the morning, only the soft creak of worn wood as he opened the door, and the sound of his boots pressing into the still wet mud. He paused by the stable, running his hand along the back of his ox. The beast grunted. No words passed between them, yet they understood. Today, the plow must carve again. With the yoke over his shoulder and the plow trailing behind like a cross too familiar, he trudged toward the first furrow. His wife, Agnes, stood silent behind him, a cloth of yesterday's tears still in her apron. Their son still slept, or perhaps pretended to, the way children do when they dread hunger's call. The first plunge of blade into soil was not a beginning. It was a continuation. There were no starts or finishes in his world, only repetition. The soil did not care for his fatigue, nor the church bell that rang in the distance. God might watch, but the land never blinked. And so he toiled, bent like a bow, silent like a grave, each furrow a line in a story that would never be told. Each seed a hope buried too deep to bloom. The sun, when it came, did not warm him. It watched, it judged, it rose and fell while he remained. A figure stooped beneath its gaze, an unnamed sentinel of the earth. Thus began the day, not with glory, but with grit, not with song, but with silence, the kind of silence only the truly weary ever learn to respect. And the field, as always, remained unsatisfied. By mid-morning, his back had already forgotten the memory of straightness. The soil beneath his feet was no longer mud, but weight, pulling him down, reminding him that even gravity conspired to keep a man low. Flakes of earth clung to his palms like the debts he owed, quiet, persistent, impossible to wash away. Behind him, the furrows snaked like scars across the field, and like all scars, they told stories no one would bother reading. In the distance, a raven croaked from the broken arm of a dead tree. Omen or not, he paid it no mind. The plow didn't stop for crows, nor did hunger wait for meaning. He paused only once, when the ox snorted hard and stopped. Its sides heaved. The beast was tired, more tired than it let on, and the man, more out of mercy than practicality, allowed it a moment's rest. He leaned against the plow's shaft, wiping his brow with a sleeve already wet with earth's breath. His mouth was dry, his stomach tighter than his belt, but he had long since learned not to listen to those complaints. Hunger was not a crisis. It was tradition. His gaze drifted toward the distant chapel, its stone tower piercing the fog like a promise too distant to grasp. Sometimes he wondered what the priest prayed for inside. Was it for rain, for mercy, or merely for peace with the sins of apathy? But such thoughts were not for men like him. He did not ask the sky for answers. He asked it for weather. When the ox moved again, he followed. Noon passed unnoticed. There was no bell in the field, only the rhythm of work. His hands bled in two places. He did not bandage them. Blood was just another water to feed the ground. In the late afternoon, his son appeared. The boy carried a scrap of bread and a half-filled flask of watered ale, both wrapped in a cloth that once belonged to his grandmother. The child said nothing as he passed it to him, and the man said nothing in return. They sat beside the hedgerow for a minute that felt like three, the wind whistling low through the dry grass, a sound that might once have been called music. "Father," the boy whispered. Finally, he turned. "When will the wheat grow?" The man looked at the field, at the sky, at his hands. "When it decides to." There were no lessons in farming. Only patience, only loss. Evening drew near like a slow, gray tide. The ox stumbled once. The man caught it by the yoke and kissed its forehead, not out of affection, but gratitude. The animal had not died today. That, too, was something. He made his way home as the sky blushed purple behind the trees. Smoke from the hearths curled up into the dusk like ghosts returning to heaven. His wife met him at the door with tired eyes and calloused palms. No words were needed. She placed a bowl of boiled barley before him. No salt, no herbs, just heat, and a spoon carved from the bone of a sheep they no longer remembered owning. That night, as the stars blinked to life over the thatched roofs, the farmer lay beside his wife, listening to the shallow breath of his son in the corner, and the deeper breath of the ox outside his window. He did not dream. Dreaming was for those who expected change. He only slept until the cock rasped again. The earth did not rest, and neither did those who served it. To the medieval farmer, time was not marked by clocks or parchment charts. It spun in circles, an eternal wheel of labor that rolled forward without end. There was no January or June in the field. There was only frost and thaw, green and gold, mud and dust. The seasons spoke in the language of soil and sky, and the farmer learned it with his spine. Spring came first in sound, the dripping of melted snow from the thatched eaves. The groaning of wood swelled with damp, the shrill, desperate chirping of birds that had survived the long dark. Beneath the surface, the earth stirred, not with grace, but with grunt and heave, as roots woke to reach again. But the farmer knew better than to trust spring's promise. It was a false friend. The sun might shine for a week, and then vanish for a fortnight behind cruel gray. The ground might thaw just enough to tease planting, and then freeze again, snapping the shoots like brittle bones. Still, there was no choice. Hunger pushed harder than caution. And so, with boots still caked in the last snow's filth, the farmer took to the field. He sowed with hands that had forgotten softness. Seed by seed, motion by motion, he bent into the wind like a tree that never breaks but never stands straight. The sacks he carried were patched and stained with the sweat of dead seasons. Each kernel he cast into the soil carried hope, but also memory. Some seeds would bloom, others would drown, a few might feed mice before man. His children came to help, though they did not yet know the cruelty of the wheel. They chased one another between furrows, dropped more grain than they planted, and laughed with mouths still round with innocence. But the sun was a patient teacher. It would burn that laughter away in time. By midsummer, they too would walk with eyes lowered and fingers stiff with callous. Summer brought a kind of anxious stillness. The green came quickly, and so did the fear. Fields of barley and rye waved like banners in a war no one ever won. A storm could undo them in a day. Hail could ruin a harvest in a heartbeat. There were nights when the farmer would stand in the doorway, watching the clouds gather with fists clenched and heart hollow. He could do nothing. There were no weapons against the sky. Worse than nature were men. Poachers crept through hedgerows in the dark. Strangers passing through might fill their sacks with stolen grain. And always, always, there were the tacksmen, riding in with scrolls and silver seals. They came not to help, but to claim. The church wanted its tithe. The Lord wanted his due. Even if the harvest failed, the price would not change. It never changed. Come autumn, the sickles returned to the farmer's hands. Reaping was swift, brutal, and bloody, not because it required violence, but because it required speed. Frost was a creeping thief. Each day it drew closer. The crops must be gathered before the earth froze again. There was no celebration, only urgency. The barn filled slowly, bag by bag, cut by cut, until its wooden walls groaned with grain and hay. And still, he worried it was not enough. Winter arrived like a judgment. The world turned white. The fields, once filled with motion, became still graves. Beneath the snow, the soil rested, but the farmer did not. There were fences to mend, animals to guard, firewood to ration. The cold entered through the bones and made a home in the joints. Children grew silent in winter, their games fewer, their eyes dimmer. The food dwindled, each meal was smaller than the last. The farmer counted not days, but sacks. A handful of flour could mean the difference between life and something far colder. And yet, through it all, the land never truly slept. Beneath the frost, roots waited. Beneath the barn, mice plotted. Beneath the surface, the earth drew breath, and the farmer, by some unspoken vow, breathed with it, because he knew the wheel would turn again. It always turned, and when it did, the plow would bite the earth once more, and the song of the soil, low, grinding, relentless, would rise again into the still air of another nameless morning. There was a sacred weight in every tool the medieval farmer touched, not because they were revered, but because they were relentless. The plow was not a symbol of prosperity. It was a sentence. The hoe was not a helper. It was a reminder. And the scythe, sharp and narrow, bore more in common with the reaper than the harvest it gathered. Each tool was passed down like a burden, not polished heirlooms, but rusted inheritances carved from iron and memory. Handles, worn smooth by the labor of fathers and grandfathers, bore the stains of blood and sweat, bone and bark. They were not crafted for comfort. They were crafted to endure. The plowshare, the farmer's iron fang, was the cruelest of all. When it bit into the soil, it did so with a shriek of resistance. The man behind it would brace his knees, tighten his jaw, and lean forward as if dragging the weight of time itself. Stones hidden beneath the surface struck back without warning, jarring the arms, rattling the chest, making the teeth clack in the skull. Many men broke their backs on such rocks. Some never rose again. Hands were the first to betray their owners. The skin split early in spring and never healed right until the following winter. Fingertips grew numb, palms grew thick and calloused, splitting into painful ridges. Splinters lodged deep and stayed. Infection was as common as mud, and without medicine, only lard, vinegar, or hope. Flesh often blackened before it ever mended. The scythe came out in summer's end. Its curve was elegant, almost beautiful, but its work was brutal. With each swing, stalks of barley fell like whispering prayers. The blade demanded rhythm, demanded speed. It cut not just crops but hands, shins, thighs. A moment's lapse, a slip on wet grass, and the scythe found flesh. The bleeding didn't stop quickly. Rags were torn from tunics. Some were lucky, some lost more than grain that day. Then there was the hoe, used year-round. A constant companion. It broke soil, unearthed weeds, and sometimes unearthed bones. A child's, a soldier's, a memory. The hoe made no distinction. It just dug. No one was exempt. The smallest children were sent into the fields as soon as they could stand. They guarded cabbages from rabbits, plucked stones from furrows, scattered birdseed decoys. Boys learned to sharpen sickles before they could read. Girls learned to carry water buckets until the rope burned into their collarbones. They didn't complain. There was no other way. Even beasts bore the weight. Oxen, silent companions in suffering, were yoked until their joints gave out. They pulled the plow until their hides festered, until their ribs showed like harp strings through their flesh. They were fed last in winter, and when they fell, the family mourned not with tears, but with fear, for when an ox died, the land grew teeth. Inside the shed, if there was one, the tools hung like saints on a poor man's altar. Nails were precious, rope was sacred, nothing was wasted. The blacksmith came rarely, if at all, and even then, only for barter. A bushel of wheat for a mended chain, a slaughtered pig for a new blade. Most times, repairs were done by firelight with raw hands and hope. Some tools were made by the farmer himself. A shovel carved from elm, a rake fixed with bone tines, a wheelbarrow patched with leather and prayer. These inventions were not born of genius, but of desperation. Necessity bred cleverness. but never rest. There was no such thing as a perfect field. The earth rose and fell like a stubborn animal. It cracked in drought, flooded in spring, froze like iron in winter. Furrows meandered, rows twisted, but the farmer kept the plow steady, not because he believed in beauty, but because he believed in duty. Crooked fields might bring gossip. Straight ones brought bread. The days bled into one another, just as the farmer's hands bled into the tools he gripped. There were no holidays in the soil. The only rest came with collapse. Muscles tore, joints swelled. Some nights, he lay in bed with arms so sore he could not lift them. His wife would roll him onto his side, rub lard into his back, and whisper no words, only breath. The tools slept against the walls like dogs waiting for dawn. Their steel dulled with use. Their wooden grips splintered, but they never betrayed. They waited, patient and cold, and when the cock rasped again, the man would rise, find his boots, and greet them like old enemies he could never kill. Because the furrow never ends, and the earth never forgets the hands that dared to shape it. The village was not just a place, it was a world unto itself. Walled not by stone, but by silence, memory, and expectation. No map marked its borders, yet every foot of soil within it was known, spoken for, watched. The path from the well to the chapel, the worn groove by the fence where children ran, the hollow under the ash tree where secrets were buried, all these were landmarks in a kingdom built on habit and hierarchy. The farmer did not live alone. He lived under the eyes of 50 others, and each eye knew his rhythm. They saw when he rose too late, when his ox limped, when his wife visited the priest too often, or not enough. The village watched not with malice, but with instinct, the way crows watch the sky. It had survived famine, plague, fire, and war, not through mercy, but through surveillance. Every man had a role, every woman a station, every child a duty. The baker's daughter fetched eggs from the widow's hens each morning. The widow, in turn, mended the priest's robes. The priest recorded births, deaths, and the unspoken transgressions between. These roles were not written in law, but in glances, in nods, in old stories told by candlelight. To step outside them was to vanish slowly, first from favor, then from memory. There was a lord, yes, but he was distant, abstract, more symbol than man. His steward came monthly to collect grain and complaints, and left before sunset. The real power in the village wore no crown. It sat in the furrowed brow of the elder who remembered the flood of '83. It stirred in the black eyes of the midwife who knew who had birthed whom and when and how. It whispered in the lips of the priest, who spoke of God but counted sins like coin. Justice, too, lived here, but not in scrolls. It lived in the dirt. A man who stole from the granary would not be jailed, he would be stared at until he withered. Until his daughter returned from market with no apples, only bruises. A woman who betrayed her husband might find her laundry gone missing, or worse, rewashed in cold river water with a stone. Children were not beaten for lying. They were ignored until they forgot the sound of their own names. The village had no jail, because it had memory, memory sharper than any blade, heavier than any law. On feast days, it laughed, bread was shared, mead flowed, songs rose over the rooftops like smoke. But even in joy, there were lines one did not cross. A farmer who danced too long with a girl not his wife would feel the sting of silence at sunrise. A boy who drank before his hands knew labor might find his boots filled with mud for a month. And yet, for all its eyes and rules, the village offered something precious, belonging. No one starved alone. When the frost killed a crop, a neighbor brought dried peas. When a roof collapsed under snow, hands appeared with timber. When a child died, the whole village wept, not out of sympathy, but out of shared terror. For if death could take one, it could take any. In the dark, when wolves howled from the forest and the wind bent trees to the ground, the village was a wall of breathing bodies and whispering fires. It was protection, even in judgment. It was prison, yes, but also refuge. It was cruel, but never indifferent. The farmer knew every voice in it. He knew whose step dragged from an old war wound, who coughed blood in the mornings, whose door creaked from sorrow more than age. He knew who had lost a child and who had buried a father. And they knew him. They knew the shape of his walk, the pitch of his laughter when it came, rare as spring thunder, the way his ox responded only to his voice. They knew his sins, both committed and imagined, and still, they shared their firewood when his ran low. There were no locks on doors in the village, not because no one stole, but because nothing stayed hidden. The village endured not because it was fair, but because it was familiar. And in a world ruled by weather, war, and whims of distant kings, familiarity was the only true comfort. The farmer did not love the village. He belonged to it, and in the end, that was stronger. There were two masters in a medieval farmer's life, the land and the ledger. The first demanded blood, the second demanded everything else. Debt was not always spoken aloud. It began in silence, quiet agreements between steward and peasant, nods exchanged over parchment the farmer could not read. But it ended loudly, with wagons emptied, barns gutted, sons taken for war. If the earth was cruel, the taxman was precise. Each season, the steward came, not with sword or whip, but with ink. He rode a horse fed better than most children and wore gloves even in summer. He did not need to shout. His silence carried the weight of law. He unfolded his ledger as if it were scripture and read the names aloud. One by one, as if summoning ghosts. The farmer's name always came near the middle, not wealthy enough to bribe his place higher, not poor enough to be ignored. The steward spoke it with no malice, no pity, only certainty. 3 bushels of rye, 1 cart of oats, 2 casks of cider, and a tithe calf, marked and unblemished. There were no protests, only nods. Resistance was not rebellion, it was starvation. Sometimes the farmer paid in full. Most times, he bargained, offered dried turnips instead of cider, a cracked wheel of cheese in place of oats. Once, he handed over a blanket sewn by his mother, lined with fox fur and grief. The steward accepted it without comment and wrote something in the margin, a number, perhaps, or a warning. The church came next. It did not knock. Tithes were God's portion, 10% of everything. Not just crops, but chickens, eggs, even the thread spun in the long winter nights. The priest collected them with bowed head and a kind voice. But behind him stood the shadow of excommunication. To withhold was to be cursed, and curses in the village stuck like tar. The priest would bless the children, sprinkle holy water over the hayloft, murmur Latin over the barley sacks. But he never left empty-handed. Even when the farmer's pantry echoed, the church bell would still ring, and the Lord's house would be warm while the farmer's chimney remained cold. Then there were the unseen debts, the ones that crept in like damp. A borrowed yoke from the neighbor, a piglet nursed in another man's sty, a favor owed to the widow who brought garlic when the fever struck. These were not written in any ledger, but they tightened just the same. To ignore them was to be cast out not by law, but by silence. And in silence, a man died faster than by hunger. When the harvest failed, the debts did not shrink. They grew teeth. Interest compounded not with numbers, but with hunger. A missed tithe became a mark. A second became a visit. A third meant the loss of something vital, a field, a cow, a son. The farmer once tried to hide a sack of barley beneath the floorboards. His son found it weeks later, after the rats had chewed through the lining and the mold had spread like ash. The child did not scold. He simply stared at his father as though he had found a secret that made the man smaller. Once, in a bad year, the steward offered a solution. Sell the boy, he said. The monastery takes strong ones. They'll teach him letters, perhaps even feed him meat. The farmer said nothing, but that night, he sat outside the barn, staring at the moon, and did not blink for hours. In time, the boy stayed, but the cow disappeared. No one asked where it went. Poverty was not the absence of money, it was the presence of constant subtraction. The farmer was not poor because he had nothing. He was poor because everything he had was already claimed by someone else. Still, he labored. He planted the next spring. Even when the barn was half empty. He paid his tithes in eggs too small to hatch. He handed the steward a cart of damp straw, smiled with cracked lips, and said, "It's the best I have." The steward wrote something again. The priest gave a solemn nod, and the farmer returned to the field, lighter by one goat, one scythe, and another piece of dignity, because dignity did not feed children, but barley might. Hunger did not arrive with horns or banners. It crept, first in whispers, then in echoes, then in screams. It began with a missing loaf, a pot scraped dry, a goat that birthed still. And when it came, it spared no one, not the old, not the young, not the faithful, not the cunning. The farmer had known lean seasons before, years when the barley came up patchy, when the apples dropped too early, when the hail broke the stalks like brittle glass. But this was different. The signs were cruelly familiar. The wheat yellowed at the roots. The skies remained blue too long. The well water turned sour by mid-August. Even the birds left early. By harvest, the truth could no longer hide. The sacks were lighter. The grain cracked too easily. The barn echoed. His wife, Agnes, said nothing, but her hands moved more slowly. Her eyes no longer followed the children with the same quiet urgency. Their youngest coughed through the nights, and there was no honey to soothe it. What little they had, they ground into a thin gruel, stretched with nettles and stale oats. It filled the bowl, but not the belly. The children learned to drink water before each meal. To silence the ache, they stopped playing. Laughter became a memory. Their ribs grew visible beneath shirts that once fit snug. When animals began to die, they were not buried, they were eaten. First the hens, then the goat, then a neighbor's dog that vanished and returned only as broth. No one asked questions, no one gave answers. Even the priest spoke less of sin and more of survival. In his sermons, heaven seemed further than ever. The village changed shape under hunger. Doors stayed shut longer, conversations thinned. The baker locked his windows. The old woman with the herb garden kept a blade at her belt. Fields that once drew neighbors together now stood guarded, each row a fortress of silence and suspicion. Then came the sickness. It always followed hunger, like a scavenger behind a dying ox. Children took fever first. They burned and shivered, eyes wide with fright, lips too dry to cry. One by one, they were carried to the chapel, wrapped in linen, unnamed in the priest's records. The bells stopped tolling. There were too many to count. The farmer dug a grave behind his house, not because the priest refused, but because it was quicker. It was for his son, 8 winters old, hair the color of straw, hands too small to hold a sickle, but always trying. He died on a Tuesday. The ground was frozen by Thursday. Agnes placed a carved spoon in the boy's hands before they lowered him. "So he won't starve," she whispered. The grief was not loud. It was dry, brittle, like stalks in frost. It hung in the house, heavy as the smell of rot and old grain. They burned his tunic, not for ritual, for warmth. After that, the farmer stopped speaking for 3 days. When he returned to the fields, they greeted him with indifference. The soil had no pity. It accepted his steps, his sweat, his silence, but not his sorrow. He sowed again that spring, not with hope, but out of habit. It was all he had left. The seeds fell from his hand like ashes. And yet, something green returned. A shoot, a stem, a whisper of renewal. The barley sprouted slow, tentative, as if unsure of its welcome. The wind smelled of wet earth again. The bees returned. Agnes wept the first time she saw a sprig of parsley grow by the stones. They did not speak of the grave, but every harvest, the farmer left the first bundle of wheat at its foot, not out of grief, not out of guilt, out of recognition. Hunger had taken more than food. It had taken memory, laughter, names, but it had not taken the field. And as long as the field remained, so too would he. Long before the plow carved its first furrow, long before the tithe cart rattled down the village road, there was faith, not the kind inked on parchment or spoken in Latin, but the older kind, the kind whispered into the wind, traced in the dirt, buried with seed. The medieval farmer did not speak of theology. He lived it, breathed it, bled for it. His God had no throne, no face, no sword. His God was the soil. And yet, he bowed to many. The chapel at the heart of the village stood crooked, leaning like an old man in prayer. Its walls were made of stone dragged by oxen from the river, its roof patched with straw and grace. Inside, the candles burned low, the saints stared with hollow eyes, and the priest moved with the solemn weight of one who knew too much and could fix too little. Every Sunday, the farmer came, not out of piety, but rhythm. He knelt not because he believed heaven waited, but because it was the only place where kneeling felt safe. The prayers were always the same, for rain, for strength, for mercy. Sometimes he prayed for less cold, less pain, fewer deaths. Sometimes he prayed for silence. The priest, Father Osric, was not a man of miracles. He was a man of routine. He spoke the Mass in a voice worn smooth from repetition, a cadence that fell like dust on the ears of the weary. But in winter, when sickness bloomed, it was his hands that poured vinegar onto wounds. When babies were born early, it was his candlelight that greeted them. And when they died, as they often did, it was his shovel that dug the graves. God, the farmer thought, must be tired. The real altar, though, was not made of stone. It was made of earth. Each spring, the farmer pressed his hands into the thawing soil and whispered a vow. Not words, but promises made in marrow. He asked for nothing but survival. He offered nothing but labor. And in this exchange, year after year, there was a kind of reverence. Agnes once said the field was a church. It listens better than any priest. She murmured, planting carrots with hands red from wind. He didn't disagree. In times of desperation, they lit fires, not for warmth, but to drive away spirits. The fire was built at the edge of the field, fed with rosemary, dry sage, and hair clipped from their children. They circled it in silence. No chant, no song, just the sound of flames and wind. The smoke rose to the stars, and whether it reached heaven or not, it always made them feel seen. There were superstitions, too, woven into daily life like straw in a thatch roof. Bread must never be placed upside down. The first egg of spring must be buried, not eaten. A mouse found in the grain was a warning, not a pest. The dead must never be named aloud in summer, lest the harvest sour. Faith was not doctrine, it was survival. The church taught that God was love, but the farmer knew otherwise. God was work. God was frost and flood and the exact day the lamb was born. God was the hand that stilled the wind or broke the fence. God lived not in heaven, but in the inches of soil between seed and root. Once, when lightning struck the chapel bell and split it in half, the village gathered, terrified. The priest declared it a sign. The blacksmith declared it rust. The farmer said nothing, but that year, he planted a row of garlic along the fence, just in case, when the pestilence came, and the village lost half its children. The priest fasted for 7 days. The farmer worked all 7. He buried a daughter without a coffin. Her grave was shallow. The earth was too hard. That night, he drank 3 cups of cider and stared into the hearth for hours. In the morning, he was back in the field. He planted beets. He did not cry, because crying was for those who believed someone would answer. Still, on Midsummer's Eve, the whole village lit torches and walked barefoot through the fields. They tossed herbs, coins, bits of bread into the soil. Some sang, some whispered, some were silent. The farmer placed a single apple, his last, at the foot of his favorite oak and bowed his head. Not for blessing, for thanks. The soil had not spared him, but it had spared something. And in a world ruled by flame, famine, and fear, that was enough to believe in. No statue was ever carved in the shape of a farmer. No tapestry hung in the castle halls bore his likeness. No bard sang of furrows and frostbitten hands beneath flickering torchlight. And yet, it was the farmer's sweat that shaped kingdoms. His silence that built cities. His footsteps, repeated across centuries, that wore down the very face of the land. He left no name behind. Only footprints, sometimes filled with rain, sometimes with ash. The medieval farmer was not remembered by story, but by consequence. The villages that still stand, built on stone laid over his broken back. The harvest feasts that fed kings, sourced from soil tilled by his sons. The peace treaties sealed over shared grain, born from barns he filled without sleep. His legacy was not written in ink, but in rhythm, in seasons, in scars. He taught nothing in words. His children learned by watching his hands, how they tied twine with weather-worn fingers. How they knew when the wheat was ready by touch alone. How they mended fence posts with pieces of memory and whatever could be found. They learned not to waste, not to wish, not to wait. They learned to rise, always to rise. And when he died, as all men did, there was no procession. No tolling of a city bell. Just a wooden cross, maybe, more often, just a pile of stones to mark the soil he returned to. The earth took him quickly. It always did, but the field remained, and in spring, the barley came again. Somewhere, deep in the bones of the countryside, his labor lingered, in the way the hedgerows curved just so, in the footpath worn between well and chapel, in the dip of land where his oxen once turned. The land remembered. The village, too, remembered, though not with words. His tools hung on a nail for years after he passed, untouched, as if still waiting for his grip. His seat by the hearth remained vacant. His name, never spoken with grandeur, was used to mark time. The year after Thomas died, they'd say, or, back when old Wren still plowed the east field. That was legacy, in its truest form, not worship, but use, not praise, but presence. He lived without monument, but his life became a foundation. And now, centuries later, his hands still live in every cracked palm that turns a spade, in every sigh that escapes over empty granaries, in every silent thank you whispered into soil that finally blooms. He lives in every rhythm of survival, because long after the kings fell, and the churches crumbled, and the parchments turned to dust, the field endured, and so did he. We walk upon the bones of the nameless. Every paved road, every cultivated field, every whisper of bread warm from the oven. Beneath them lie the stories of men and women who bent their lives into the soil so that others might stand upright. They did not write books. They did not lead armies. They did not build cathedrals. But without them, nothing would have been built at all. The medieval farmer did not dream of greatness. He dreamed of enough, of rain that came gently, of children who lived to plant their own seeds, of winters that passed quietly, of a harvest that did not betray. And in those humble dreams, he left behind a legacy stronger than stone, a testament written not in words, but in work. We remember him not because history told us to. We remember him because something in the human soul still echoes when wind moves through wheat. Because somewhere in all of us, there is a longing for the simple courage of those who rose with the sun, labored through hunger, buried their grief in silence, and sowed hope anyway. Their names are gone, but their footsteps remain, and the earth, ever watchful, remembers every one.